He stepped into the diner just like any other day. But today, everything changed. All because he stood up for a waitress who was being humiliated. That night, as he slipped his hand into his pocket, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, an old, weathered key. He had no idea how it got there. And when he finally found the lock it belonged to, a secret beyond imagination was unveiled. Was it pure coincidence? Or a mysterious gift from fate? It was a chilly autumn evening, and David had just wrapped up another exhausting day at work. As a construction engineer, long hours and demanding projects had become his routine. Hungry and too tired to cook, he pulled into a small roadside diner he had passed dozens of times, but never actually visited. The neon sign flickered slightly, casting a dim glow onto the nearly empty parking lot. Something about the place felt oddly comforting. Pushing open the door, he was greeted by the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon. The place was old-fashioned, with red leather booths and a jukebox humming a soft tune in the background. A handful of customers sat scattered around, mostly truckers and night shift workers grabbing a late meal. David slid into a booth near the counter, enjoying the rare peace and quiet. When the waitress came over, he ordered a simple burger and coffee, barely looking up as he scrolled through his phone. But just as he was about to take his first sip of coffee, a sudden outburst shattered the peaceful atmosphere. A loud, mocking laugh echoed from the other side of the diner, followed by the sound of a chair scraping aggressively against the floor. David's eyes darted up. At a corner table, 3 well-dressed men sat sneering at a young waitress, their voices dripping with condescension. One of them, a man in a tailored suit, obviously wealthy, was speaking loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "I said, bring me another cup of coffee." "What, are you deaf?" he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. The waitress, a thin girl barely in her 20s, fumbled with the coffee pot, her hands trembling. The suited man exchanged glances with his friends before smirking. "You know, for a tip, I'll give you a chance to prove you're not completely useless. How about you pick up that money from the floor?" He flicked a $20 bill onto the ground. Silence fell over the diner. The other customers averted their eyes. No one moved. No one spoke. But David, he felt something stir deep inside him. And he knew he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. The waitress froze. Her face burned with humiliation as she stared at the crumpled bill on the greasy floor. Her fingers tightened around the coffee pot, her knuckles turning white. The entire diner seemed to be holding its breath. No one dared to look directly at her. No one wanted to get involved. The suited man leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smug grin, waiting for her to obey like a trained pet. "Go on," he taunted. "It's free money. All you have to do is swallow your pride a little. Shouldn't be hard for someone like you, right?" His friends chuckled, taking casual sips of their drinks. The girl bit her lip, blinking rapidly as if trying to hold back tears. For a split second, she bent down, her hand reaching toward the bill, but something inside her hesitated. She wasn't just picking up money, she was being tested, humiliated for their amusement. David could feel the anger boiling inside him. He didn't know this girl, but he knew this moment. He had seen people like this his whole life, those who used their power to belittle others, just because they could. His fingers curled into a fist under the table. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He waited for someone, anyone, to step in. But the other customers kept their heads down, pretending not to notice. Cowards. The waitress straightened slightly, her hands shaking as she clenched her apron. She was about to walk away, trying to swallow the insult, but before she could take a step, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound cut through the tense silence like a knife. All eyes turned toward David. He had pushed his chair back and stood up, his face calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. He picked up the $20 bill, turned to the suited man, and dropped it right into his coffee. There. Now it's worthless. Just like your respect for others. The entire diner went dead silent. The only sound was the faint dripping of coffee as it absorbed into the $20 bill, staining it dark brown. The suited man's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His friends gawked at the sight, their amusement turning into shock. The waitress, still frozen in place, stared wide-eyed at David, as if she couldn't believe someone had actually stepped in. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the suited man growled, pushing his chair back aggressively. His face twisted with anger as he glared at David. "You just ruined my drink." David didn't flinch. He met the man's furious stare with an unwavering gaze, his voice steady and sharp. "Number, I just ruined your little power trip. You want to throw money around like it makes you important? Maybe next time, try using it for something other than humiliating people." A tense silence hung in the air. The suited man's jaw clenched. He looked around, expecting someone, anyone, to back him up. But the other customers, who had once been too afraid to speak, were now watching intently. The weight of their silent judgment was palpable. Even his own friends didn't seem eager to support him anymore. The waitress swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the two men. She looked like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. "You think you're some kind of hero?" the suited man sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea who I am." David tilted his head slightly, a hint of a smirk forming on his lips. "Doesn't matter who you are. It matters what you just did." The suited man's nostrils flared. He grabbed a napkin, wiped his hand, and stood up abruptly. He pulled out his wallet, tossed a few bills onto the table, and turned toward the exit. His friends hesitated before scrambling after him, their laughter gone. As the door swung shut behind them, the tension finally broke. A soft murmur rippled through the diner. Someone clapped quietly. A trucker in the corner nodded in approval. And the waitress? She exhaled sharply, her shoulders trembling, not with fear this time, but with relief. But David had no idea. His night was far from over. David sat back down, his heart still racing. He hadn't planned to get involved, but something about the way that man had treated the waitress made his blood boil. As he reached for his coffee, he noticed the waitress still standing there, gripping her apron tightly. Her eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one's ever stood up for me like that before." David gave her a reassuring nod. "You don't deserve to be treated like that. No one does." She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper. "Your meal's on the house," she said with a shy smile. "It's the least I can do." David chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," she insisted. "People like you, they're rare." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving David alone with his thoughts. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The tension in his body was finally easing. He reached into his jacket pocket for his car keys and froze. Something was there, something that hadn't been there before. Frowning, he pulled it out, a small, old-fashioned key, cold against his palm. His brow furrowed. It was heavy, made of dark iron, with intricate engravings running along the shaft. It definitely wasn't his. He turned it over in his fingers, his mind racing. Where had this come from? David glanced around the diner, suddenly on edge. Had someone slipped it into his pocket? If so, why? He scanned the room, but no one was looking at him. The waitress was busy cleaning a table. The truckers were chatting among themselves. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Like this key meant something. Like it was waiting for him to figure out its purpose. What the hell had he just gotten himself into? David turned the key over in his palm again, feeling its weight, the coolness of the metal against his skin. It wasn't an ordinary house key. The intricate engravings, the old-fashioned design, it looked like something from another time. His gut told him this wasn't just some lost trinket. Someone had put it in his pocket for a reason. He glanced around the diner one more time. Nothing seemed unusual. The waitress was wiping down the counter. The truckers were finishing their meals, and the hum of conversation filled the air. No one was watching him. No one had a reason to. David set the key down on the table and stared at it, half expecting something to happen. But it just sat there, ordinary yet completely out of place. He let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe he was overthinking this. Maybe someone had just dropped it, and it somehow landed in his pocket. But that explanation felt too easy, too convenient. His curiosity burned. He had to know where it came from. "Excuse me," he called out to the waitress as she passed by. "Do you recognize this?" She paused, glancing down at the key in his hand. The moment her eyes landed on it, her expression changed. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the rag she was holding. David saw something flicker across her face. Shock, disbelief, fear. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my pocket," David replied slowly, watching her reaction closely. "I don't know how it got there." The waitress swallowed hard, looking around the diner as if checking to see if anyone else had noticed. Then, leaning in slightly, she lowered her voice. "That's impossible." "Why?" David asked, his pulse quickening. "What does it open?" She hesitated, then whispered, "This key belonged to my grandfather. He used to own this diner before he disappeared 20 years ago." David felt a chill run down his spine. The key in his hand suddenly felt heavier. This wasn't just some lost object. It was a clue. And whatever it unlocked, it was waiting to be found. David's grip on the key tightened. The weight of the waitress's words sank in. 20 years ago? Disappeared? This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had slipped this key into his pocket for a reason. "What do you mean he disappeared?" David asked, his voice low. The waitress hesitated, glancing around again as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, taking a deep breath, she leaned in and spoke in a hushed tone. "My grandfather, Henry Dawson, owned this diner for decades. He was a good man, kind, generous. But one night, he just vanished. No trace, no note, nothing. The police searched, but they never found a single clue. The only thing missing from his office? His key." David's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He looked down at the old-fashioned key in his palm. "And you're saying this is the same key?" The waitress nodded slowly. "I recognize the engraving. I remember playing with it as a kid. My mom told me never to touch it, that it was special. But then, after he disappeared, it was gone." "So, how did it end up in my pocket?" David muttered, more to himself than to her. It didn't make sense. He hadn't been near the office, hadn't touched anything. Someone, or something, had put it there. But why? "There's only one place that key could fit," the waitress said, almost to herself. "My grandfather's old office in the back. It's been locked ever since the night he vanished. My family never opened it. It felt wrong, like we were disturbing something that wasn't meant to be touched." David exhaled sharply. He had walked into this diner just looking for a meal. Now he was holding the key to a 20-year-old mystery. "Show me the door," he said. The waitress hesitated, clearly torn between fear and curiosity. But finally, she gave a small nod and motioned for him to follow. They walked past the counter, past the rows of customers still lost in their meals, and into the back of the diner. The further they went, the quieter it got. The hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and something else, something heavier. A strange sense of anticipation filled David's chest. At the end of the hall stood an old wooden door, its surface worn but sturdy. A single keyhole sat beneath the tarnished brass handle. The waitress swallowed hard and whispered, "No one's opened this door in 20 years." David stared at the key in his hand, then back at the door. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and slowly pushed the key into the lock. With a soft click, the past was about to reveal its secrets. The key turned smoothly, almost too easily for a door that hadn't been opened in 2 decades. As the lock clicked, the waitress sucked in a sharp breath. David hesitated, gripping the handle before finally pushing the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a dimly lit office frozen in time. Dust coated every surface. A wooden desk sat against the wall, papers still scattered across it. A faded photograph of a young girl, probably the waitress when she was little, stood on the corner. But what caught David's attention was the filing cabinet in the corner, its drawers slightly ajar, as if someone had searched through it in a hurry. "This is exactly how he left it," the waitress whispered, stepping inside cautiously. "Nothing's been touched since the night he disappeared." David moved toward the cabinet, his instincts screaming that this was the key to the mystery. He reached for the top drawer and pulled it open. Inside, under stacks of old receipts and notes, was a small leather-bound notebook. He flipped it open, eyes scanning the first few lines. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "I know what they did. I have proof. If anything happens to me, this will be my only record." David's pulse spiked. "Your grandfather knew something. He was in danger." The waitress's hands trembled as she took the notebook from him, flipping through the pages. Dates, names, amounts of money, records of something big. Her breath hitched. "These are payoffs," she realized. "Bribes. Someone was using this diner to launder money, and my grandfather must have found out." Then her eyes landed on a name she recognized. Her face paled. "No." "What is it?" David asked. She turned to him, voice shaking. "The man from earlier, the one who insulted me. His father was the owner of this diner before my grandfather, and he's still one of the most powerful men in this town." David clenched his jaw. This wasn't just an old mystery. This was a crime that had gone unpunished for 20 years, and now the people responsible had come back, maybe to make sure no one ever found out the truth. "We have to take this to the police," David said firmly. "Your grandfather tried to get justice. Now it's your turn." The waitress, eyes brimming with determination, nodded. The past was no longer buried. Justice was finally catching up to those who thought they had gotten away with it. And thanks to one mysterious key, the truth would no longer remain locked away. As the sun began to rise over the small town, David watched from a distance as the police carried out boxes of evidence from the diner. The corrupt businessman had been arrested, his crimes finally exposed after decades of silence. Justice had been delayed, but not denied. The waitress stood beside him, clutching her grandfather's old notebook. She turned to David, eyes filled with gratitude. "If you hadn't stood up for me that night, I never would have found the truth. Thank you." David smiled. Sometimes, doing the right thing leads you to places you never expected. As he walked away, he reached into his pocket one last time. The key was gone, as if it had only appeared when it was needed, and now its purpose was fulfilled. What do you think? Was this fate or something even greater at work? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Because sometimes, the smallest actions can unlock the biggest truths.